My name is Carlos Ernesto Michaeletis, and they call me El, my alias. To put that way, that nothing takes away from me or anything. It turns me on. I am what I am, and I'm sure of what I am. I'm not proud of what I am, but neither can I cry because I'm not here. Life goes on. Do you understand? Music, a drastic follow-up that few could imagine against Old Lin. Something so drastic that would ensure he would never bother anyone again. But what did he do? How far did Bukele go? Stay until the end of the video and discover it. In the dark framework of the CECOT prison, the imposing figure of Old Lin had been a threatening shadow, an indomitable force that seemed unbreakable. But even the most fearsome shadows meet their end when they defy the brightest and most powerful light. For Old Lin, that light was President Nayib Bukele, a man whose hatred for the Mara leader had reached its climax. News of the kidnapping of Bukele's daughter had spread like wildfire in a dry field. Rumors said that Old Man Lin had orchestrated the kidnapping from Zelda, using his influence to hit the president where it hurt the most. The little girl had been rescued thanks to a covert operation, but the damage had already been done. Bukele's fury was palpable, and his decision was immutable. Old Man Lin must pay with his life, and his execution must be an example to everyone. The day of the execution dawned with a gray sky, as if even nature agreed with the gravity of what was about to happen. The prison was quieter than usual. An air of anticipation and fear enveloped the inmates. The orders had been clear. Everyone was to attend the prison center where Old Man Lin's live execution would take place. No one. He was exempt. The guards dragged Old Man Lin from his Zelda to the center of the courtyard, where a platform had been erected despite the circumstances. Lin Man wore a defiant expression on his face. He knew his end was near, but he would not show weakness. Around the platform, the prisoners gathered in silence, their gazes fixed on the man who had been both a leader and an oppressor. Nayib Bukele appeared on the scene with a terrifying calm. He wore a dark suit, and his eyes shone with a determination rarely seen. He took the microphone and, in a firm voice, addressed those present. Today, El Salvador will see justice. Today, those who have lived in terror will know that their suffering has not been in vain. Today, Old Man Lin will pay for his crimes. Old Man Lin was forced to kneel in the center of the platform. The murmurs among the prisoners were almost inaudible, but the tension in the air was tangible. Bukele didn't take his gaze off the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. Lin said, his voice echoing in the courtyard. Your days of spreading fear are over. The guards parted and the crowd held their breath. The execution would be neither swift nor merciful. Pokolo, he had decided it would be a powerful message, a reminder of what would happen to those who dared to challenge his authority and threaten his family. The minutes that followed were a testament to Old Man Lin's brutal end. The first shot rang through the air, striking his leg. A cry of pain escaped his lips, but his eyes remained defiant. Bukele wanted every second of suffering to be etched in the memory of those present. A second shot, this time to the shoulder, caused Lin to partially collapse, his body trembling with pain, but the execution didn't stop there. Bukele approached, looking the fallen man with a mixture of contempt and triumph. This is for my daughter, he said before delivering the final blow, a shot straight to the heart that silenced Old Lin forever. The silence that followed was deathly. The prisoners looked on with a mixture of horror and relief. The tyrant who had dominated their lives was dead, but the cost had been extremely high. Nayib Bukele turned to them, his voice once again filling the space. Let this be a lesson. No one is above the law. No one is above El Salvador. Old Lin's body was removed, and the prisoners were escorted back to their cells. News of the execution spread quickly outside the walls of the CECOT, and the reaction was mixed. Some celebrated Bukele's decision, seeing it as a long-awaited act of justice. Others criticized the brutality of the event, arguing that justice should not be confused with revenge. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, we invite you to give us a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue the days following Old Lin's execution. Old Lin's execution had left an indelible mark on the city. However, what came after his death was a true, or descent into hell for the prisoners. Nayib Bukele decided to eradicate any trace of Lin's influence and sent a strong message to all criminals in the country. He implemented harsher measures than ever before. The prison became a place of suffering and despair, where hope faded under the weight of repression. In the days following the execution, the conditions in the CECOT became unbearable. The cells, already cramped and gloomy, seemed even more oppressive. The prisoners barely had room to move, and the stench of overcrowding and lack of hygiene became unbearable. The guards, now under orders to show no mercy, patrolled the hallways with unwavering vigilance. The prison lights remained on 24 hours a day, depriving the prisoners of any chance of adequate rest. The constant buzzing of the fluorescent lights became an audit trail that undermined inmate morale. Mealtimes became unpredictable, and rations were drastically reduced, leaving inmates hungry and weakened. One of the first notable changes was the establishment of a daily discipline hour at 6 a.m. All prisoners were forced to leave their cells and line up in the central courtyard under the watchful eye of armed guards. They were made to stand for hours without moving under the blazing sun or torrential rain. Any attempt at resistance or complaint was met with brutal beatings and exemplary punishments. Silence was another of the new rules imposed on prisoners. They were forbidden to speak to each other. The cells were constantly monitored, and any murmur was enough for the guards to burst in and punish them. Those responsible for this forced isolation broke the bonds of camaraderie that some had even developed, increasing the feeling of loneliness and hopelessness and attempts at rebellion. Small acts of rebellion that were once common were crushed with ruthless brutality. A group of prisoners who tried to organize a silent protest was dragged out of their cells in the middle of the night. Screams of pain echoed through the corridors as they were tortured and then confined in isolation cells, without contact with the outside world. But perhaps the most ruthless measure was the establishment of the punishment chamber. This dark room, located deep in the CECOT, became the final destination for those who dared to defy the rules. Prisoners who were taken there didn't know when or if they would emerge. The complete darkness, combined with sensory deprivation and total isolation, drove inmates to the brink of insanity. For prisoners, fear became a constant. The uncertainty about who would be next to be taken to the punishment chamber or the hour of discipline kept them in a state of perpetual tension. Desperation was reflected on their faces, and hopes for a better life quickly faded. Bukele, for his part, maintained iron control over the prison. His sporadic visits to the CECOT were seen as a terror by the prisoners and with respect and loyalty by the guards. For Bukele, this was a war he could not afford to lose. He had demonstrated his power with the execution of Old Man Lin, and now he had to ensure that his dominance was absolute and unquestioned in the midst of this hell. Some prisoners tried to maintain a spark of hope. Stories of possible escape plans were whispered. Although they knew that any attempt would practically be suicide, the camaraderie, although repressed, could not be completely eradicated. Some inmates shared their food rations or exchanged bland, supportive glances, reminding him that it had become a place where suffering was the norm and hope a luxury. The execution of Old Man Lin had only been the beginning. The true torture was daily life in El CECOT, a hell on earth from which few expected to emerge alive. Sanity. Bukele's speech on the night of July 10th. Bukele appeared on television with his usual presence, wearing a dark suit and a firm gaze. The stage was prepared with a sobriety that reflected the gravity of the moment. In front of him, a microphone captured each word with a clarity that resonated in the homes of millions of Salvadorans. "Good evening, Salvadoran people," Bukele began, his voice firm. "En clara. Today, I address you at a crucial moment for our nation. In recent days, we have seen an avalanche of criticism and condemnation from various corners of the world. We are accused of brutality, of violating human rights, and acting with excessive harshness. To those critics, I say, they don't understand our reality. Bukele paused, allowing his words to sink deep into his ears. Science. El Salvador has suffered under the yoke of gangs for too long. The streets of our cities have witnessed unspeakable acts of violence, families torn apart, and youth trapped in a cycle of crime and hopelessness. The Maras, Salvatrucha, and other gangs have been a symbol that has infected every corner of our country. The president looked directly at the camera, his expression hard and resolute. The execution of Old Man Lin was a difficult but necessary decision. It was a symbol of the terror these gangs have inflicted on our people. We could not allow their legacy of violence to continue. And yes, we have taken drastic measures in the CECOT, but we have done so to send a clear message. In El Salvador, there is no place for gang members. I want to be absolutely clear. Bukele continued, I will not stop until we have completely eradicated gangs from our nation. This is a war for the survival of our people and for the future of our generations. Criticism will not make me back down. On the contrary, it strengthens my resolve. Lin's childhood was a whirlwind of tragedy and helplessness that pushed him down a dark and lonely path. Born in an impoverished rural area of El Salvador, Lin was the third of 5 siblings in a family where hunger and violence were constant companions. His father, a violent alcoholic, abused his mother and children, leaving them physically and emotionally scarred from an early age. Lin learned that violence and aggression were acceptable ways of dealing with the world. His childhood was marked by a lack of affection and a constant sense of danger. He often had to search for food in the trash or steal to feed his family. School was a luxury he could rarely afford, as hard work and survival were his family's primary concerns. As Lin grew up, he became increasingly resentful and distrustful. He saw his father as a role model, a man who imposed his will through brute force. The idea that life could be different, that he could be different, seemed increasingly distant. At age 12, Lin witnessed the death of one of his brothers at the hands of a rival gang. This tragic event marked a turning point in his life, filling him with hatred and a thirst for revenge. He decided to join the local gang, where he found the sense of belonging and the protection he longed for. For him, the gang was a family, a refuge in a world that had rejected him. Over time, Lin rose through the ranks of the gang, gaining respect and fear in equal measure. His reputation for being ruthless and merciless preceded him, and he embraced it as a shield against a world that had hurt him time and again. The descent into evil on the morning of January 7th, 2003, the press graphically, he proudly announced that the UN had completed the verification of the peace accords, thus marking the close of a symbolic cycle. The word peace could be officially considered completed and filed away in some New York office. That same night, the old Linja, identified by the police as the main leader of Barrio 18 in El Salvador, visited the Dina neighborhood in southern San Salvador to embrace and show his support for Chino Picer. However, the young local leader, the atmosphere in the area was tense due to a recent incident in which Picer had ordered the execution of one of his soldiers, known as El Cush, as punishment for losing a weapon. This action outraged part of the gang, especially Cranky, the leader of the nearby Iva neighborhood. He had influence in the area and warned Picer that the life of a member of the gang was not worth a lost weapon. Despite this, the 19-year-old Picer felt strong enough, safe to decide for himself what was fair in his territory, in his drug market, and on the 8th Street he controlled for the leadership of the gang and for Lin, who was his visible face that same night while Lin and Picer were talking. Crank and his lieutenant, Duke, arrived at the Dina and waited after Lin left. They approached Picer, pulled him aside, and murdered him in the street with 17 shots from AK-47s and M1s, weapons of war used to send a message to all members of the gang. The way they were being governed could not continue. Lin considered Cranky's action a betrayal, believing he should have been consulted before making that decision. For him, killing someone he had just hugged was an intolerable breach of trust. Motivated by Lin, Many armed gang members sought out Cranky and Duke in the following days to avenge their actions. Picer's death, although they were unable to find him, marked the beginning of a deadly confrontation to establish limits and make it clear that in Barrio 18 there was only one way to punish and only one judge. In the 1970s in Los Angeles, a white man approached a Salvadoran child. He was about 12 years old, looking out the window of a restaurant, and said with a contemptuous accent, "You don't speak Spanish," implying that he shouldn't speak Spanish. These words echoed in the boy's mind, who years later became a gang member, adopted the name Lintz, joined the East Street Gang, and got his first 18 tattooed as a symbol of belonging in El Salvador. Decades later, no one remembers that X, which was changed to an I. Here, he is Lin, and on July 2nd, 2011, he turned 49. The influence and mystery surrounding Old Lin in the Barrio 18 neighborhood are due in large part to his enigma and the shadow he casts, which changes in height and impenetrability depending on the light and perspective from which it is viewed. His authority often seems mythical, reigning over burly, armed men. His rise to the top in late 2002 is an enigma to many, with rumors suggesting that in the 1980s he sold drugs to the Barrio 18 neighborhood in the United States. Although some doubt that he even speaks English or has been to the North, Lin's guerrilla past with the Central American Revolutionary Workers Party, PRTC, also contributes to his long shadow. Although he himself publicly admitted his membership in the PRTC, rumors within the gang exaggerate this, making him appear even more formidable, as if he had learned to be tougher and more deadly in the guerrilla. This effect is also seen in other 40-somethings from the Barrio 18 neighborhood who served in the army during El Salvador's Civil War. Having fought in a war grants them an aura of respect and experience that young gang members cannot match, even despite their most violent and extreme acts. The irony that Lin's first prison sentence was that of a revolutionary is not lost on him when captured. At 18 years old, in an ambush in Sonsonate in February 1981, he was imprisoned in the Sonsonate prison and then in clandestine prisons before being transferred to La Esperanza in Mariona, where he occupied a cell reserved for political prisoners. Although he was captured along with guerrilla leaders such as Arlen Yosapa and Celia Margarita Alfaro, who still received tributes from the PTC, Lin seems to have been forgotten by many in the FMLN. Another PTC militant who shared a sentence with Lin remembers him with long, curly hair, always wearing a dark hat and a green cap with a pin on the visor. He was described as serious and not fond of jokes. He was someone to talk to. This meant being willing to engage in intense conversation due to his seriousness and clarity of thought. His prison record includes his imprisonment for subversion and his release by direct order of the Supreme Court of Justice on April 1st. In 1982, after his time in prison, Lin returned to the mountains, fighting on the Guapa volcano under the command of Manuel Melgar, the current Minister of Security. Although his former partner claims that Lin deserted the PRTC in 1983, Lin only mentions that he returned to Los Angeles, where in the 1980s he joyfully welcomed the first graffiti of the Mara, Salvatrucha gang in neighborhoods inhabited predominantly by Central Americans. He celebrated the rise of Salvadorans in the city, being a member of the Eing's street gang at that time. The deadly enmity that has united the MS-13 and Barrio 18 since 1989 did not yet exist. Although Lin maintained closer ties to El Salvador than most of the young people who grew up in Southern California with a Salvadoran surname and nostalgia, speaking, thinking, and acting in English, he did not take root there and return to his country. His shadow faded until an archive revealed that he entered the Santa Ana prison on December 29, 1992, accused of robbery, but was released 6 months later after being found innocent. He returned to the same prison on October 12th for homicide. By the way, if you enjoy the video, we invite you to give us a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue. What is his life like in the CECOT? Since his arrival at CECOT, Lin has maintained a reserved and distant attitude, distancing himself from internal conflicts among inmates. His reputation as a gang leader has preceded him, which has earned him respect among some inmates and fear among others. However, despite his seemingly privileged position, Lin has chosen to stay out of disputes and alliances within the prison, preferring to keep a low profile and avoid calling out Lin's daily routine in prison. It is monotonous and bleak. He gets up early every morning to eat a bland, substanceless meal. During the day, he spends most of his time in his cell reflecting on his life and the decisions that led him to that place. Sometimes he is allowed out into the yard for a few hours, where he paces in circles, lost in his thoughts while watching the other inmates with a blank, unfocused stare. Lina's relationships in prison are few and superficial. Although some inmates respect him for his history in the gang, is viewed with distrust and caution by most. Aware of his reputation for being ruthless and merciless, Lin has learned to live with loneliness and isolation, becoming his only company amidst a sea of unfamiliar and hostile faces, despite his apparent resignation to his fate. There are times when the shadow of his past grows heavier, on lonely nights when the silence of prison envelopes him. Lin finds himself haunted by memories of his former life. He remembers the faces of those he hurt and the lives he destroyed on his way to the top of the gang. He wonders if he can ever redeem himself for his actions, if he can ever find the peace he so desperately yearns for. One could say he had the opportunity to have a different life. One could say Lin had the opportunity to have a different life. Despite growing up in a difficult environment and having faced numerous adversities, there were times in his childhood where he could have taken a different path had he received the proper support and guidance. For example, if Lin had had access to a quality education, he could have developed different life skills and perspectives. Furthermore, if he had received the necessary emotional support at home, he could have learned to manage his emotions in a healthier way and develop more positive relationships with others. However, given the circumstances of his childhood and the environment in which he grew up, Lin was pushed down a path marked by violence and crime. The lack of opportunities and pressure from his surroundings led him to make decisions that ultimately led him down a dark and dangerous path. Lin's story is a reminder of how life's circumstances and opportunities can influence the course we take. Although he had the opportunity to have a different life, circumstances conspired against him, leading him to a path that would change him forever. And so we come to the end of this video. If you liked it, I invite you to give us a like so we can continue making more videos like this one. Also, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our new videos. I wish you a great day. See you next time.